Welcome, everybody. Sabeeha, Walter, great to have you here.
Thank you for having us. Good to be here.
Good with you.
Now, Sabeeha, where are you right now?
I'm in New York City, in Manhattan.
Walter?
Where am I? I'm actually in New Jersey visiting family. I normally live in Frederick, Maryland, but I am today in Bloomfield, New Jersey.
All right, well, we got a national thing going. I'm here in Hermosa Beach or Los Angeles where the sun's shining and beautiful. So let's bring some brightness to the world over here. And great place to start would be if you could briefly, I know from my experience, that's really hard to do, briefly introduce yourselves, like personally what you do, and then we'll go from there. How's that? So old school, ladies first.
All right. So my name is Sabeeha Rehman, and I am an American Muslim of Pakistani descent. I grew up in Pakistan, and I have lived here in the United States for almost 50 years. I'm married to Khalid. This November, we celebrate our 50th anniversary, inshallah.
Nice.
Yes.
And I'm a mother of 2 young men and grandmother of 4. I am an author, a blogger, a public speaker, and an interfaith activist. And what I do a lot these days, in addition to writing, is going on the virtual tour with Walter doing book talks. And so far with our new book, which is We Refuse to Be Enemies. We've done,
which you just happen to have right beside you, of course.
Yeah, I just carry it in my arm all the time. Who knows when I may get a chance to show it. And we've clocked in 50 book talks. So that's what I do.
Super. That's super exciting, and welcome. Walter.
Thank you. So my name is Walter Ruby. I'm an American Jew, and I was born in New York. I lived some 3 years in Israel. I also spent a few years in the former Soviet Union, just as it was collapsing, as a journalist. So my first part of my career was as a journalist for American Jewish and Israeli newspapers, and then I segued into being a person who worked in Muslim Jewish relations, which I've been doing now for about 15 years, and so let's see, I have a son who lives in New York, and I have my present wife, my third wife, Tatiana, and I live in Frederick, Maryland. And as Sabeeha said, for the last 4 months, I've basically been on a virtual tour, which has been wonderful. Just communing with these incredible people around the country, and feeling they're being really, really excited to hear about our book and giving them also some hope and solace at a difficult time.
Yeah, no, welcome. Well, we got to meet just recently too, when I heard your story, and it's a topic that I'm super interested in, and so is our company. So I got to admit, I'm almost 2/3 into the book and loving it. So congrats on that. I really appreciate it. And tell us, before we get into your experiences, tell us how you both came together.
So it's interesting, Walter was engaged in bringing Muslim and Jewish communities together, and he can tell you more about it. And I, at that time, was working for the American Society for Muslim Advancement, and Walter reached out to the office. He wanted him and the rabbi to come and meet with Daisy Khan and the imam, and I answered the phone. And that's how we initially connected. And from that point on, we found ourselves in the same interfaith spaces. We had no idea where this off and on, relationship would take us. But then in 2016, I was getting ready to publish my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug. And it occurred to me that it would be a good idea to get a blurb from a rabbi. And I thought of Walter. Now, Walter, of course, is not a rabbi, but he worked for Rabbi Schneier. So I emailed him. I was in Pakistan visiting family at the time, and I said, Walter, I've written this book, and do you think that Rabbi Schneier would be willing to write a blurb? And Walter said, I have to read the book. So I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on a Saturday going through the whole manuscript, and then he writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to do a blurb. but I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book? Right, Walter? So why did you come up with this idea?
Right. So I want to start out by saying I don't, I did a lot of blurbs doing helping Rabbi Schneier. I mean, I would write the first draft. He would go along with it. He would. So I did a lot of that, but this was the first time I ever asked anybody who suddenly asked me to do this to whether they wanted to, whether we should write a book together. So why did I choose it? So there's another piece of the backstory too, which was that I had sort of promised Sabeeha I would do this, and then as things happened, a few weeks went by and I hadn't done it, and then she called me on a Friday afternoon and she said, "I need this Monday. We need this right away. I need it Monday morning." So I said, "Okay, I'll do it." Swallow, and I said, "There goes my weekend." And as she said, it was my day of rest. But anyway, I picked up her book a little begrudgingly at that point because and I fell in love with it immediately. So it was just a wonderful, wonderful book. Threading my prayer rug, as she said, her memoirs and a memoir in progress. Just a wonderful book on many levels, funny, trenchant, thoughtful, the values that touched me very much, and it's sort of an immigrant story. Anyway, so I said, okay, she can write. This is really, so the thing was that I've been looking for a Muslim co-writer for some time, for a few years by that time, because I wanted to do, first of all, I wanted to share the story of the Muslim Jewish movement that I and others had been engaged in starting in around 2005, 2006, and had made real progress in bringing together Muslims and Jews around America. I thought that was a very important story that nobody knew, or very few people knew, except those who were kind of been touched by it directly. Very important to share that story. So I've been wanting to do that. And then, but at the point Sabeeha contacted me, it was 2016, as she said. I think it was before the election, but by the time we sort of agreed and we sat down with a tape recorder in her apartment the first time to talk about the book, we all know what was going on. And by that point, I felt that we needed a kind of a manifesto. Part of the book needed to be a manifesto of why it was so important for Muslims and Jews, as the two largest minority faith communities in America, to stand together, stand up for each other, stand up for democracy, human rights, and religious freedom. All of these values which make the Muslim and Jewish life really bearable in this country. So it was both that, sharing the story, and many other things. And it became also sharing our personal stories. But that is how we got going with the book.
So the bottom line is, it's really lucky she answered the phone.
I'm sorry?
The bottom line is, it's really lucky that Sabeeha answered the phone.
Oh, yes, it's definitely lucky. Absolutely, absolutely. Otherwise, I would have spoken to Daisy Kahn, but Daisy was already writing her own book, so she probably didn't need me to. And she writes wonderful books too. But
it's probably not lucky. Things happen for a reason. So that's where we're at. So I want to get right into it. I wonder if you guys could share some of your experiences, some of your stories, like I've heard, a little bit before. I'd love you to take it away and just share some, because I think the audience will love it. So you're on.
Ladies first again?
Absolutely. Are you kidding?
Okay. So when I was growing up in Pakistan, I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan is pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, and to this day has not recognized Israel. So I viewed the Jews through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In fact, my father's passport was stamped all countries of the world except Israel. And that is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. It was December, close to Christmas. My husband, who was a medical resident, took me to the hospital's Christmas party. Half the medical residents were Pakistani Indian and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very nice to me. Now, this was my first encounter, and seeing them being so welcoming, like saying, "We hope you're not homesick. Do you miss your family? How can we be of help?" I had difficulty reconciling my negative perception of Jews with the positive experience I was having. Then I find out that the nice lady upstairs in our apartment building who had taken me under her wing was Jewish. My husband's boss, who was opening doors for him, mentoring him, was Jewish. Then I get pregnant and my obstetrician is Jewish. I have a baby and the pediatrician who I loved was Jewish. And then I end up buying a house in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I had no idea what I was getting into. I liked the house. I bought the house. And on Saturday, I decide to go introduce myself to my neighbors, and I go ringing doorbells, and I'm wondering why they're not answering the door. So very soon, I found myself hanging out with my Jewish neighbors, and somehow interfaith dialogue just started organically. We are standing on the lawn, literally from the grounds up, watching our children. I was a homemaker, and this was the 1970s. So we would be out watching our little boys, children playing. I must have invited one of them over for dinner. The conversation must have gravitated to dietary restrictions. And now we're saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either. And is halal and kosher the same thing? She must have invited me over for coffee. And I would have said, I'm sorry, but it's Ramadan. What is that? And that's literally how interfaith dialogue started. At some point, I realized that it would be nice if my Jewish neighbors could meet my Muslim Pakistani friends, because I didn't want my Jewish friends to think that perhaps I was unique, or that maybe I was not like the rest of them kind of Muslims. But I also wanted my Muslim friends to see how nice all these Jewish families are. So we ended up in my living room, and we would, hang out together, all the families, the children. And eventually that led to larger gatherings in larger spaces. And that's literally how interfaith dialogue started, very much from the ground up. How about you, Walter?
Well, I had never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s, a Muslim or an Arab for that matter. I mention that because I grew up a lonely Jewish child in suburban Pittsburgh. And at the age of 11, I read a book called Exodus by Leon Uris, which was about the creation of the state of Israel. And I sort of fell in love with that. I said, boy, I would love to be there. I want to be part of that. And then, like a good fairy, sort of got involved in this. Literally 3 months later, my father came home from work. He was a physicist working at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh, and he said to me, "Hey, we're going to go to Israel in a few months. I got a sabbatical at the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot in Israel." And first I thought he was joking, but that's what happened. And we went there. I spent my 6th grade year in Israel, so it was an incredibly powerful, incredibly transformative year for me. And I felt totally at home there, and I totally felt fulfilled as a Jew. And it was, really life-changing experience. But I never met during that period, I did not meet either a Muslim, a Christian, any Arabs. So that was, but then I desperately wanted to stay. Again, I'm 12 years old at this point, but my parents, decided to go home. Interestingly, my mother, who I'll speak of later, had been a refugee from Hitler's Germany, had fled for her life. And she said, I love Israel, but I don't want to risk the lives of either of my sons in the Israeli army. So that's why we came back. But I vowed I would go back. I said, I can't be happy anywhere else. And when I was 26, I did move back to Israel. I had a Christian wife at that time. We went there together. That relationship ended eventually, but then I had 3 years in Israel, mostly living in the north of Israel in Haifa. I became a journalist, and I was writing for the Jerusalem Post and other newspapers up there. And so I started going out into the Arab communities of the Galilee as a journalist, essentially, to interview folks. And that was very, very powerful. First of all, it showed me, firsthand the systematic discrimination that Arabs, both, you could say Palestinian citizens of Israel, were experiencing and still are. And so I saw that firsthand, but I felt something else, which was the transformative power of personal encounters, because I was encountering people that, we started out as journalists and subject, but then they would invite me home. And we just had these really deep conversations about the realities of Israel, and they were very moved that I, as a Jew, had come out there and I was open to hearing what they had to say. So that was very, very powerful. There was a priest involved, an Arab Christian, an Arab Greek Greek Orthodox priest, whose name is Father Elias Shakur, and he was a very charismatic figure who is well known. In those days, he was really working kind of as an activist, trying to self-empower the people in his community of Ibalin. When they didn't get funding from the government, they, for a while they were saying, well, this is discrimination. Why is the Jewish town getting funding to build a community center? And he said, we can build our own community center, let's do it. And he would organize them to do it. So he had a huge impact on me. I came back from there. I went told my Jewish friends and my relatives, and I'll talk about them, who lived on a kibbutz not far from, all in the same small area. But basically the response was, first from many of my friends, was that, you're a nice guy, Walter, but you're naive. You don't know the Arabs, we do. So don't let the wool get pulled over your eyes. And I had that experience with my uncle, who I really, really venerated. His name was Uncle Zeev. He was part of the founding generation of Israel. And he, the builders generation, he had escaped the Holocaust. His wife also, they're the only members of their families who escaped the Holocaust. He came and he fought in the 1948 war, the War of Independence. And then 25 years later, they lost their only son in the Yom Kippur War, 1973. So now we're three years after that, and I'm meeting with them and I'm talking to them about Father Shakur, and in the belief that maybe that would give them some solace to see that there are Arabs living not far away that are talking definitely about nonviolence, about finding ways, but I said there's hope, and someone like Shakur really inspired me. My Uncle Zev also responded, you just don't understand the Arabs. And then suddenly it hit me. I sort of walked in the fields. I took a break. I went outside. I was walking the fields. I said, my goodness, I can almost see to Ibalin from here. It's so close. It's like 10 kilometers. So when I came back, I said, Zev, have you ever been to Ibalin? And he said, well, yes, of course I have. And I said, well, when was that? And he said, he thought about it for a while. And he said, I think I was there once in 1943. This is, of course, now 1977. And so he saw my eyes go up like, aha. And he said, basically, okay, so you think, don't get too full of yourself. I haven't been there in 25 years, you were, or more than that, and you've been there, you were there last week, but don't think that means that you understand anything better than I do. I know what they want, and they want to destroy Israel and so forth. So out of all of that, I saw, and Zev wasn't the only one, that most of the people who were telling me that had never had a conversation like I had had, not only with Father Shakur, but with so many Arabs. So what it showed me is that, the power, again, of personal encounters, that you have to go out and that humanizes the other. The other becomes not a sinister abstraction, but a flesh and blood person with many of the same, dreams and aspirations and hopes for their children that we all have. So that was very, very important to me. And I came back to America in the early 80s. I became a journalist. I covered the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I soared with it as it went up. Again, I'm covering it as a reporter, but I felt, very invested in it. And when it all went south in the early 2000s, it just, it was a personal tragedy for me. And at that point, I got involved in Muslim-Jewish relations, a kind of a serendipitous thing that just kind of happened. But I saw it as kind of an alternative route to peace and reconciliation. So I was fortunate enough to get hired as Muslim-Jewish program director at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. I began getting involved in bringing rabbis and imams and Muslim and Jewish community leaders together, trying to get them to do twinning events between, say, the mosque and the synagogue in cities across America, and then in Canada, and then in Europe. And it was just an amazingly positive experience. There were setbacks, but it was going so much better than I thought it would. And at some point I said, wow, I'm really doing holy work here. So, and at that point, I may have picked up the phone the next week and called Sabeeha, and now you've caught up to where we were before.
And one of the things that Walter and I talk about in terms of the values that are common to us is welcome the stranger. Both the Quran and the Torah command that. And we've compared stories of our mothers, because both our mothers were refugees and both were welcomed in the new land. My mother, when in 1947, just a year before Israel was created, Pakistan was created. The British divided India, the subcontinent, into India and Pakistan. My mother lived on the Indian side, and she made a train ride across to Pakistan to make a new home there. On the way, the trains were attacked by mobs. She almost didn't make it across. It was a harrowing journey that I talk about in detail in the book. But once she made it across, she was welcomed as a stranger in her new land, and there she lived, and there she thrived. And until her dying day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. And I experienced that feeling of being welcomed when, after having spent half my life in the United States, I was made to feel like a stranger when the 2016 elections took place, presidential elections. And on the morning after, I wondered, I actually felt an existential threat. Can we ever survive in the United States? We have become strangers. And that's the day I got a call from the rabbi of our neighborhood synagogue. He called my husband Khalid and said, "We are standing in solidarity with you, and I would like to go with you to a mosque." So my husband took him to the mosque for Friday prayers. And as he was entering, he said, "Should I remove my kippah?" Keep it on. So he walks in, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Muslims, saying their prayers in congregation, sat beside my husband on the prayer rug, listening to the Imam's sermon. And people from the community, non-Muslims, were filing into the mosque to stand in solidarity with us. After the prayer was over, people lined up to come and shake the rabbi's hand. He stood out. He looked very much a rabbi in this congregation. And shaking his hand, saying, "Thank you. Thank you for coming." And then a man walked up and he said, "I would like to give you a gift, but I have nothing on me except for my family heirloom." And he held up his prayer beads and he said, "I would like you to have this." The rabbi's eyes teared up. I tear up every time I think about it, because these are the moments when one thinks of what Martin Luther King meant when he said, "It's only in the darkness that you can see the lights." Walter has a similar story.
Yeah, well,
Only in the darkness can you see the stars.
Right. My mother was a refugee too, as I think I already mentioned. She fled Nazi Germany for her life, and literally ran across the border with her own mother when my mother Helga was 14 years old, fled into Belgium. And then they had a almost 3-year journey before they were able to get to the US, running through France and running for their lives a second time when the Nazis occupied France. They eventually managed to buy some visas that got them as far as Lisbon, Portugal, but they couldn't get to the States because they were these quotas. They're very really anti-Semitic, really quotas keeping the number of Jews allowed into America to a tiny number. This was the first era of America First, with these disastrous immigration regulations, and so many hundreds of thousands of Jews who might have been saved were not. My mother eventually did get to New York, but illegally in a sense, because they had visas to go to Ecuador. They wanted to come to the States. So what happened was, when they landed in New York, an organization called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, this was prearranged, took my grandmother into the city to see if they could find a person with the same last name, an American citizen, who would take responsibility for them. And the interesting thing is, during that period of more than a week, my 16-year-old mother was held as surety on Ellis Island, was not allowed to leave, to make sure her mother would come back. They were able, fortunately, to find such a person. And that's another long story, which you can read about in the book, but they stayed. And my mother lived her whole life here. She had a wonderful life, loved America deeply, although she was not blind to its faults, and she was involved in the civil rights movement. She wanted to make the country she loved even better. She passed away in 2005. And in 2018, as we say, flash forward, as Sabeeha says, I had the opportunity, and really one of the moments I treasure most in my life, of speaking at a rally in front of the US Supreme Court, calling for the Supreme Court to strike down President Trump's Muslim ban, this really obscene ban, which was preventing people from escaping life-threatening situations, getting to hear desperate refugees from Syria or Yemen or Iran and other countries. And so I was given the chance to speak at that rally and to share my mother's story. But the point was to say, this is what my mother went through in the 40s, and it's so much like what's going on for Muslim refugees and other refugees today. But specifically Muslim refugees who, because of this racist ban, essentially this Islamophobic ban, their lives are being put in terrible peril, and they have no refuge. That's exactly what my mother went through. And when I hear the president of the United States sneer at illegals, well, my mother was an illegal too when she landed on Ellis Island. She eventually had the chance to contribute to America, do wonderful things like so many other people who came here, not necessarily with all the papers in order. And so it's so much like what happened then. And anyway, that was a wonderful moment for me. Sabeeha?
One of the things that Walter and I talk about in terms of the values and the principles that are common to our faith, another one is standing up for one another. And never did I experience and feel this as deeply as I did after the travel ban was announced. And Walt and I and my husband found ourselves in Times Square at a rally on a cold February morning on a Sunday. People there had surrounded us holding placards that said, "Today I am a Muslim too." And Walter's organization, the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, had organized it. These people were not Muslims, but they had come to stand in solidarity with us. As I walked through the crowds, I came across a woman in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s. She could barely lift her head. And I sat down, lowered myself to make eye contact with her, to say thank you to her, and she couldn't lift her head up. I wondered about what it took for her to be there.
Yeah.
Somebody must have helped her into her woolies, gotten her into a wheelchair, onto the sidewalk, hailed a cab, gotten her into the cab, folded her wheelchair and put it in the trunk, gotten her into Times Square, the whole process all over again. And there she sat, protesting loudly with her silence.
Nice.
And all the other people, on their day off, they could have been anywhere, but they chose to come and stand out there in the cold for hours to express their solidarity. It wasn't too long later, afterwards, when the tables were reversed, and now it was time for the Muslim community to stand up for their fellow Jewish Americans. You want to tell us about it, story, Walter?
That date, which I'll never forget, was October 27th, 2018. And I woke up on a Sunday morning and I turned on, CNN late morning, and I witnessed this horrendous aftermath of it was the Tree of Life synagogue in my hometown of Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
where a deranged neo-Nazi gunman had erupted into the synagogue and shot 11 Jews dead, 11 Jews at prayer, shot them dead. And I had this just sickening sense as I'm sitting there stunned watching this. I said, my God, for the first time in my life, I don't feel safe as a Jew in America. That had never happened before. I'd never had that feeling before. And so a very, very, very dark moment for me and Jews everywhere and Americans of all backgrounds. But at that moment, almost at that moment, as I'm sitting there, I see on the television screen a group of men in Muslim dress who were standing outside the police line and holding up signs saying, "We're with you, we love you." They were from the Islamic Society of Pittsburgh, and they had had a prior relationship with the Tree of Life, a twinning relationship, if you will. Not one I can take credit for, but that was the case. And so that really, they knew each other already, but there they were, and they were, you know, expressing this beautiful sentiments. It meant so much to me at that moment. We're your brothers and sisters. We're here for you. Subsequently, there was a fundraising effort nationally. In 48 hours, the Muslim community of America raised like $200,000 and just for the stricken Pittsburgh Jewish community. And then finally, the following Shabbat, the services, there were, you know, synagogue services all over America in you know, in memoriam, essentially, in tribute to the Pittsburgh community. And thousands, tens of thousands, I believe, of Muslims came out to those services, often on they just showed up, and it was so powerful just to show their solidarity. And I was at one such service in Virginia, Northern Virginia, and there was the hall that I was in as we watched the screen, because we couldn't even get into the sanctuary, it was so full. But in the hall I was there, I was surrounded by Muslims, and to me, and they were just so beautiful. And so to me, that was a moment, a shining moment of light in the darkness, as Sabeeha said. Want to share very quickly with you the two last values that we really animate our book. One is the aphorism that if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. That happens to be both in the Talmud and in the Quran. But until I got involved in this work, and I'll tell you how it happened, I had no idea that it was in the Quran. And I found out later Sabeeha had no idea it was in the Talmud. Very few Muslims know that, you know, it's a Jewish text, and very few Jews know it's a Muslim text. The text is so important because it basically says every human life is precious, and we have to fight, you know, we have to do everything to save every life. And that is really an animating principle. And that, you know, it's so important that that we share that beautiful value, as we do others, we do many others, but also the importance of learning about each other and finding out our similarities, because our two communities in many ways are sort of separated at birth in interesting ways, with the same patriarchs and matriarchs, many of the same places. And yet we know so little about each other right now in this point in history. And I think a lot of that is due to, you know, the estrangement that's happened over the last century, really, over the Israel-Palestine situation. Finally, the last one, I'll just mention the last value that's so important is, in Hebrew, it's called tikkun olam, which means repairing the world. And in Arabic, there's a term islah, which means basically reforming the world. So they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. So they overlap. They express the common moral imperative in both faith traditions to help those who are most in need in society, regardless of their background. And so many of the events that have brought us together, the twinning events, have been going out as Muslims and Jews together to feed the hungry. Sometimes we visited the sick. We've held health fairs for people, Muslim and Jewish doctors and dentists serving people without insurance, and so forth. And those moments are so powerful, to stand in a homeless shelter together, with putting on aprons, standing behind the, you know, at the serving line, ladling out hot, you know, soup, you know, rubbing shoulders as we do it. It just brings us together in this incredibly powerful way that so many people who share that experience, even if they don't even have time to really deeply engage, they feel very close, and so many incredible friendships have come out of that effort. So those are the core values.
Yeah, but you know, those are good. Those are success stories that we just shared. But it hasn't always been easy. We have had our share of challenges. And one of the challenges that I have faced repeatedly is the difficulty that I have in mobilizing the Muslim community to get engaged in interfaith dialogue. There are many who do, but there are many who are not ready for it. And I'm not sure what the reason is. It could be that we are still a young community in terms of evolving and maturing as interfaith activists, but it could also be that there is some degree of lack of trust. And if that's the case, which I believe is to a large degree, then there's a lot of work that we have to do to bring them along. Walter, you want to share a few challenges you faced?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree with Sabeeha. It's been much more success than failure in all this, but there have been setbacks, and often, and I've seen in different cities. Sabeeha talks about the difficulties of bringing Muslims into some of these efforts, and I've seen it with both communities. In some cities with the Muslims, some cities with the Jews. Oftentimes, not always, but I would say most of the time, it really involves what we call one of the two elephants in the room. The first elephant is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as you can imagine. And what we have seen is that whenever there have been moments of violence, such as the one we just went through, between Israelis and Palestinians, often, the bombing of Gaza, the missiles flying out of Gaza, everything that's come out of that, that has set things back, because people who normally, rabbis and imams who already had built relationships, were suddenly like not picking up the phone and calling each other. From my perspective, they were supposed to be organizing twinning events in their cities in a couple of weeks, and I call them, they haven't called each other. And I said, well, what's going on? And they sort of admitted, that it's just uncomfortable to make that call right now. We didn't want to have that difficult conversation. And so again, very, very important to pick up the phone and do it. And eventually they would, but it often took a while. The second one, though, there's a second elephant, which is the difficult passages in our in our holy texts, I would say, that can deeply, can offend one or the other. And I myself had felt offended personally as a Jew when I read some of the presentations of the Jews in the Quran. And many of them were kind of very judgmental, it seemed to me, kind of shaking the finger at the children of Israel. God brought you out of Egypt. He opened the Red Sea, and what do? You get across there and to Sinai, and the next thing you know, you're worshiping the golden calf. Like, what's that all about? And then Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, brings back the 10 Commandments, and again, the children of Israel are going astray at various points. So they strongly castigating them. And so I did pick up the phone and I called imam friends of mine and learned people. And I said, well, how do what do I do with this? And they said something really, it should have been obvious, but what they said to me was, Walter, go read the Torah. It says the same things in the Torah about the children of Israel and how they betrayed God. I went back and I sort of remembered it, but I'm not religious and I don't normally read the Torah, but there it was. Went there it was, of course, and not very dissimilar language. And I thought, what's going on here? So I tried to think about my own reaction, and I said, what's going on here is this human psychological tendency or tick or whatever you want to call it, that if we're allowed to criticize ourselves, we're allowed to laugh at ourselves. And here I'm talking about not just the Jews, but the Muslims, the African Americans, the Asians, whoever. We're allowed to laugh at ourselves, but God forbid somebody else should criticize us or laugh at us. So I got that, and didn't make me love those passages anymore, but it made me understand them, and it made it possible for me to go on working and and growing closer to my Muslim colleagues. I think, and this is what I want to leave you with right now, the most important thing is pick up the phone, those 4 words, have that conversation, even though it's sometimes uncomfortable. And that's really a big part of what's made it possible for us to move this whole thing forward, and made it possible for Sabeeha and I to come together and learn a huge amount from each other.
So it's funny you say, first of all, it's got to be a super interesting topic to keep me quiet that long. I will tell you that. But thank you. I mean, it's spectacular, and I've read some of the stories in the book too, and I am I find it interesting. You said the most important thing is to pick up the phone. So Sabeeha, thank goodness you picked up the phone when Walter called.
That's true.
It's funny how that works, I guess. But I want, there's a million questions, and I've been told many times I simplify things too much, and I guess that's a combination of, just being ideological and being. And I did somebody years ago. One of my influences, brilliance is simple, and it took me a while to understand. You can have complex problems, but the answer is actually pretty simple, and that's brilliant. And you say pick up the phone. That's pretty simple. It's a brilliant answer.
And answer the phone.
And answer it, and even talk would be a good idea.
Even nowadays, do Zoom, even better. Right?
Well, now people break up on texting. They don't even tell the person they don't want to go out with them or something. But doesn't it get down to, this is my simplification, it really gets down to having the courage and the desire to learn more about other people and other food and other cultures and other everything. Isn't that what's the most exciting thing of all? Is to, would we rather all be the same and eat the same food and all that? Or isn't this awesome that we're different and we do these different things? That's number one. And that's why I found it interesting in the book. So I've had some experience like that too, when you had the interfaith dinners and somebody was saying, I need a Jew over here, I need a Muslim over here. I mean, how did that make you feel when you heard that?
Yeah, actually, that's the opening chapter of the book. This was an interfaith dinner, and the rules were that you have to have an equal number of Muslims, Jews, and Christians at the table. Don't let all the Jewish people congregate together and same for the others.
Right? It's not a high school dance, I know.
Exactly. So, and people had already taken their seats when this announcement was made. So now everyone was getting up, and trying to look, like where can I find a seat which is empty? And people were standing up and saying, I need a Jew at this table. I need a Muslim at this table. And, the Muslims are getting up and running over to the Jewish table, and they're pulling their seat and saying, oh, yes, sir, thank you for coming, and the Muslim is running over, and the Jew is running over to the Muslim table, and they're saying, thank you, welcome to our table. And that was the moment when the rabbi stood up and said, when I see a Jewish person standing up and saying, I need a Muslim in my group, and vice versa, this is heaven. And that struck me. I had not gotten it until he said that. And that's when I felt that for a moment that I had found my lost paradise. And that was a glimpse into the future that I wanted for my children, for my grandchildren, and for my country. That's how it felt.
It's amazing. And I think you brought this up, Walter, about your uncle, who the gentleman was, that said, you don't understand them. I've had people tell me, there's no peace. You're never going to have peace. And how can you take away the hope that it's never going to happen? How can you just eliminate that and give up and say, you're right. And so it's so great that you did. And I want to ask you about one of the elephants. Is it a gorilla or elephant in the room? I can't remember which one. Either one, but
elephant is bigger.
Elephant's bigger, probably. Well, I would say
might be scarier, though, right?
Gorilla's pretty smart too, but I don't know. So how did you navigate, the whole thing about not talking about the Palestinian-Israeli situation to get people not hung up and stuck on that and being able to learn to trust each other? How did you both do that? Walter, start with you.
Yeah, so it was some trial and error, but we started when I became the director of Muslim Jewish relations at the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. We kind of came up with the concept that if we can't just brush it under the rug. We thought at that time, but we don't want the encounters that we're creating, the twinnings, to be about that. So what we did was we urged the rabbi and the imam at the twinning event, before the event, just say, let's start the event with a prayer for peace in Israel and Palestine, a prayer for peace and justice for both peoples, and a happier time. And they would do that very, very movingly, and but they would offer those prayers, and then we would, but then someone would get up and say, okay, great, we've done that, but let's be clear now that the remainder of this meeting is about building relationships, working together here in Los Angeles or here in Chicago or wherever it was taking place, not about having the 633rd arid debate on who's right and who's wrong over there, because that's going to almost certainly leave us more pissed off at each other than when we started, and we don't want to do that. And we did. So that was basically the formula, and it worked most of the time. But not perfectly, and certainly the moments that I talked about before, when the violence would happen, it was clear that it wasn't fully working. And so we've been struggling, and as we've gone along, Sabeeha, why don't you share your experience in the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, and then we can take it to where we are today. So.
In the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, we were given a rule that for 18 months, your chapter will not discuss politics. You need to give at least that much time for relationships to develop, for trust to develop. So we agreed. And for 18 months, we did not talk about the Middle East conflict. And after 18 months passed, we still didn't talk about it. And then another 18 months passed, and we still didn't talk about it. Things were going so well that nobody really wanted to wade into murky waters. But this time around, with this current conflict, in some venues, we are talking about it. For a number of reasons, one being that we feel that we've reached a point in our relationship where we can take on a sensitive issue without jeopardizing our relationships. However, whereas in some forums, it has worked out well, nobody left the room, there have been other instances where relationships have unraveled, where alliances have fallen apart. So it's not completely a rosy picture.
So you know what? In Los Angeles, we say you want to keep them wanting more. And that's when you get a sequel created for the movie. So what I'd love to, I got a million other questions. I'd love to do the sequel coming up really quick, because there's a lot more questions that I have, about this. And so maybe for this segment, if you could just kind of conclude in however you want to conclude, but we're going to continue and tell some more stories and be ready, because I got a lot more questions and sharing. So, Sabeeha, why don't you conclude for this?
Yeah, I would like to conclude with the core message of our work as well as our book, which is that Muslims and Jews need to come together. We are minority faiths in this country, and there is a lot more at stake. There's much more that brings us together and unites us than what divides us. In this country, democracy is at stake. We know what happened on January 6th. We know where that is taking us. It's not a thing of the past. It is a prologue of things to come. Just look at what's happening with voter suppression laws being passed around. We need to come together if we want to preserve democracy, if we want to preserve pluralism. So we cannot allow the Middle East conflict to divide us here at home. We are Americans, and we have to put America first.
Amen. Walter? Yeah, I would just say, picking up on something you said, Mark, about why give up hope, or and yes, and so much of the narrative on both sides with Israel-Palestine, but you can also see it, even in our two communities here, is we can never get along, and this is something we're doomed to forever, and that is exactly what we're trying to fight against. And we're saying, listen, let's give our children some hope. Let's you know, what needs to start right here. We want to engage them also, but if we can begin the process of coming together, of getting to know each other, and seeing that the other isn't some sinister monster out to kill us, it really it almost right away, you know, you make that friendship, you just, you know, make that first, wow, I really like her, I really like him. You're already way down the line, because you can never sort of think that way again. You can and that's really, it's as I think you said, it's not rocket science, but it really does work. And we've seen a phenomenal growth in Muslim Jewish engagement since I first got involved back in 2006 and 7, which I never would have expected. I mean, I hoped for it, but I didn't know it would come this far. And it's been just so uplifting and so moving and so terribly important for both communities. So really, really happy and proud to have been part of all this.
You know, hate takes a lot of energy, and it gets you nowhere. And the person that's hating is the one that uses the most energy versus the person that's being hated. So that's another thing we just got to realize. What a waste of time, you know, to do that. And
Right.
I mean, there's going to be a lot of questions from economic interdependence to, you know, not defining us by, you know, 3 or 4 decades ago. Where are we now? To a whole bunch of stuff I want to get into with you guys. But thanks for sharing the stories. They're amazing. Thanks for rating the book. Hopefully I'll finish the last third before our next encounter here. And just thanks for making a difference in what you're doing out there.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.